Let's go ahead and get started. We had not quite finished our text for last week. We were just about ready to build the temple last week. If you'll recall, we had been talking in chapter 5 about Solomon succeeding King David and consolidating his position and his reign, and how he took care of the people that David told him to take care of, in the sense of get rid of Joab and so forth. And at the beginning of chapter 5, we have this statement that Hiram, or as the writer of Chronicles calls him, Huram, the king of Tyre. Now, Tyre is a city on the Mediterranean coast. It's a Phoenician city, Tyre and Sidon. Later on, we'll be familiar with Tyre and Sidon because Jezebel, who marries Ahab on several hundred years down the road, Jezebel is a princess from Sidon, and she brings the worship of Baal, false gods, into Jerusalem proper, and it's just not a good scenario altogether. But at this point, Hiram, who is the king of Tyre, has been on very friendly terms with King David, and he wants to continue that relationship with Solomon. And so Hiram sends an embassage, a group of servants to Solomon, and they have their back and forth. And Solomon sends him back word, you know what my father planned to do. David had clearly communicated to Hiram what his intentions were, and that the Lord had not permitted him to build the temple that he wanted to build, and so forth. Well, now David's gone. Solomon is on the throne. He has had time to consolidate his position and his circumstances. Let me shut this door so that I talk loud, so that we don't disturb them. And so now that he's firmly ensconced, he's probably been on the throne for somewhere between 2 and 4 or 5 years at this point. Everything is kind of, although the dust has settled and the upheaval has settled down. So now he's ready to start moving forward with the plans that his father had tasked him to carry out, to build the temple. And he starts to put the pieces in place. David had arranged with Hiram for materials and so forth. Now Solomon is going to renew those contracts, as it were, that friendship, that alliance. And this also tells us something about the character of the Phoenician people at this particular period in time. Now, the Phoenicians are not noted for being worshipers of God. In fact, the Philistines were a Phoenician people, coastal people like that, and their worship was of Dagon, a fish god, back in the days of the judges. And this will continue on through the time of the kings. And the Philistines, who actually live slightly south of Tyre and Sidon, they're going to be a constant back and forth with Israel in war, in territory, in slavery and tribute of each other. David had subdued them very thoroughly and very firmly. Solomon will keep them just fully under his thumb. But Hiram and the people of Tyre and Sidon, they're a little bit north, and they're not in that same category. They're trading partners of the Israelites, and they're on friendly terms, and they seem to at least be respectful of, if not worshipers of Israel's God. And that's a sharp distinction in some ways with a lot of the other people surrounding Israel who were antagonistic to the idea of one God. Well, Solomon starts taking steps to put everything into motion. And among other things, he starts drafting people. Now, when you flip over to 1 Kings chapter 9, and you look down here at about verse 20, we find that Solomon uses slave labor to do some of what he does. Not the building of the temple per se, but the administering of the country and taking care of needs within the country. And you pick up at verse 20, all the people who were left of the Amorites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, who were not of the people of Israel, their descendants who were left after them in the land, whom the people of Israel were unable to devote to destruction, these Solomon drafted to be slaves, and so they are to this day. But of the people of Israel, Solomon made no slaves. They were the soldiers, they were his officials, his commanders, his captains, his chariot commanders, and his horsemen. Now, before we go any farther, we need to make a couple of points here. Number one, the slavery that they practiced was not race-based, in that these people, in terms of their genetics, there's not 10 cents worth of difference between them. Culturally, they're poles apart, but genetically, they're in many respects they're the same people. They have the same common ancestors. But these are also the Perizzites and the Hivites, the Amorites, and so forth. Who are these people? These are the descendants of people that God had commanded Israel to drive out of that land in the days of Joshua because of their idolatry. They were the people, these are people who had lived in this land. Their ancestors had lived in this land in the days of Abraham, 400 years before the people of Israel came out of slavery in Egypt and came into the land. These are the descendants of people who had worshiped gods comparable to Chemosh and Moloch, who their religion involved sometimes human sacrifice and things of that sort. And when God told Moses, and then Joshua after him, you drive these people out, what were the instructions that he had given them? Number one, you run them out. Number two, if they won't run, what do you do with them? You kill them. And the thing that we have to remind ourselves of here is that conflict in the days of Joshua was not, our world looks at that and says, oh, the Hebrews committed genocide here by trying to wipe out these societies. But this was not just territorial expansion by the Hebrews. This was not just rank invasion like the Russians seem to be proposing to do to Ukraine today. This was God using Israel as his instrument of judgment against these different peoples because of their idolatry and their corrupt, immoral practices like child sacrifice and so forth. So it was an action of judgment. One thing that stands out, though, going back to the days of the judges and the days of Joshua, Israel, every tribe in Israel, even Judah, stopped short of finishing the job. So we get down here 350, 400 years worth of judges between the time of Joshua and the time of King Saul. And what do we discover when King Saul becomes king? You've still got Philistines and Amorites and Hittites and so forth living in the land. And of course, the Gibeonites, back in Joshua chapter 9, Joshua made an ill-advised treaty with them, and lo and behold, they're right smack in the middle of the territory that Israel is supposed to occupy. Well, he put them to service, forced labor. But all these other peoples, they were supposed to be completely driven out or obliterated, and every single tribe stopped short. Well, Mr. Brown, come on in, sir.
How are you?
I'm well. Have a seat. Make yourself comfortable. So, Mr. Paul Brown, Ms. Shante, Ms. Sharia,
Okay.
fellow students. So, in those days, they didn't finish the job. You get down to the time of King Saul, and in the region of what would become Jerusalem, well, you've still got Canaanites living there, the Jebusites that had never been completely conquered by the tribe of Judah. So David subdues all these people where Saul had fallen short. Solomon now has them all under his thumb. But these are people that by rights, they should not have been left in the land. God, when the children of Israel stopped short, God says, all right, I'm going to leave the remnants there, and they're going to be a pain for you, a thorn in your side. And sure enough, they were. But here, Solomon puts them to forced labor. Now, that probably was not an issue to the Israelites. I mean, think about the Israelites' cultural, historical, national experience. They've been slaves for 400 years in Egypt. So they've been on the other side of that coin. But something else that Solomon does, come back here to chapter 5, and you look at verses 13 through 18 here in 1 Kings chapter 5. King Solomon drafted forced labor out of all Israel, 30,000 men, and sent them to Lebanon, 10,000 a month in shifts. They would be a month in Lebanon and 2 months at home. Adoniram was in charge of the draft. Well, these are not slave laborers per se. Now, go back for just a moment. Go back to 1 Samuel chapter 8. The elders of Israel come to Samuel, the last judge, and they say, you're old and your sons are not faithful, so give us a king so we can be like the nations around us. Makes Samuel just hot as a firecracker mad, but he goes and pours it out to God. God says, fine, you do what they want of you, but here's what you warn them about. Here's what their kings are going to do. And among those things, lo and behold, they're going to draft your sons for labor. Along comes Solomon, and 30,000 Hebrew men are drafted. Forced labor in a sense, not slaves outright, but they're, I guess you'd call them impressed labor. They may well have been paid, but yeah, like indentured servants. They didn't have much choice in the matter. And he sends them, 10,000 a month to Lebanon. Well, what's in Lebanon? Forests, trees, lumber, and stone and so forth. And he's using them primarily as supervisors, it appears, but still he's using them for his public works projects. Solomon is going to be the greatest builder in Israel, at least until Herod comes along and rebuilds the temple. And that's almost 1,000 years down the road in the time of Christ. So Solomon is using these guys, and it's interesting. The text here mentions Adoniram, the supervisor of all these guys. Well, he was evidently not too popular himself, because you jump over to chapter 12 and verse 18, on down the road a piece. 1 Kings chapter 12 and verse 18. And what do we discover there? Well, there is a little upheaval, shall we say, toward Solomon's policies. Solomon himself seems to have been personally very popular, but after Solomon dies, Rehoboam, his foolish son, becomes king. Rehoboam sent Adoram, or this Adoniram, same guy, who was taskmaster over the forced labor. And what did they do with him? They stoned him. Now, it may well be that it's Rehoboam's fault that Adoram or Adoniram winds up being stoned. It may not have been anything that he himself did, but that's an indicator of just how unhappy the people were with what Solomon started, and then Rehoboam tried to accelerate. Solomon had been taxing the people for his public works projects. Solomon laid a heavy burden on them. After he dies, Rehoboam becomes king, and Solomon's advisors basically say, young man, if you want this people to love you, cut their taxes. And all of the young bucks and the young fools like him say, oh, no, you need to You need to double down, make it twice as hard on them. And that's whose advice he takes. And that's when the kingdom gets split. Well, all of that traces back to Solomon's public building projects and his drafting of indentured labor. That's a good term, good way to describe it. Indentured servants among his own people. They didn't have a lot of say in the matter. Now, they were involved in projects that they'd be proud of. And surely the greatest project that comes out of Solomon's reign is going to be what? Well, it's going to be the temple, obviously. The temple is widely considered to be the eighth wonder of the ancient world. And it's amazing when we start looking at it to see what it is and what it's not, because what we picture usually in our minds, the image that we have, and you look at Cecil B. DeMille in the movies and so forth, what we're seeing in our mind's eye is probably has a lot more in common with Herod's temple in Jesus' day than it does with Solomon's temple in this ancient time. For one thing, Solomon's temple is actually very small. The whole temple structure would fit out here in the parking lot, including the porch. It was a little over 100 feet long and 45 feet wide, about 30 feet tall. It was not a huge, imposing structure. Well, compared to the average house in that day, it surely was. But, it was not a massive structure that covered acres and acres and acres of ground. Well, that's the lasting legacy. And it's interesting, we come back here to 1 Kings chapter 5. Solomon is contracting with Hiram, the king of Tyre, not just for material, but what else? You come back down here, my father David, verse 2, verse 2, verse 3 rather, could not build a house for the name of the Lord his God because of the warfare with his enemies, until the Lord put them under the soles of his feet. But now the Lord my God has given me rest on every side. There's neither adversary nor misfortune. So I intend to build a house for the name of the Lord my God, as the Lord said to David my father, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So come down here to verse 6. Now therefore, all right, we're getting down to the contract now. Now therefore, command that cedars of Lebanon be cut for me, and my servants will join your servants, and I will pay you for your servants such wages as you said, for you know that there is no one among us who knows how to cut timber like the Sidonians. In other words, I don't have the skilled labor to do this job. I need to hire your people. Well, as we go on down, we find that Solomon hires thousands of Sidonian laborers for their variety of skills, their artistic ability, and so forth. Now, go back to Exodus chapter 20, and what's one of the fundamental commandments God gives? No engraved images, no idols, no imagery. In fact, the conservative Jews took that to mean you don't even paint pictures and things of animals and whatnot, not even just for decoration in your home. Well, what we will see here are windows with lattice work and geometric designs and so forth, but you won't see animals depicted anywhere in all of this. But Solomon needs artisans and craftsmen that he doesn't have. And you think about, how could things have changed so dramatically when the tabernacle was built 400 years earlier? Israel comes out of Egypt, and at Mount Sinai, God gives the 10 commandments and gives the instructions for the tabernacle, and the people give all of their supplies and stuff that is needed, and God provides Bezalel and Aholiab, two Hebrew men, to supervise the construction of this and gives them understanding of art and construction and so forth. How could we go from being able to do that down to the point where we don't have any kind of skilled craftsmen to do this? Well, over the 400 or so years in between, Israel has basically done two things in their national history. They've waged war, and they've raised herds and flocks and been farmers and raised vineyards. They are not an industrialized nation at all. They live in an area where their income and their wealth is measured in their crops and their flocks and their herds. There's not a lot of industry or technology. And so now they need skills that are not common in Israel. But go over to the Mediterranean coast, to Tyre and Sidon. Well, who are these people? These people don't live by farming or by herding or shepherding sheep or anything. They live by fishing and by trading. Well, what do you have to fish in the Mediterranean Ocean? If you want to catch very big fish or very many fish, you got to have boats. You got to have ships. And that means you've got to have people that understand woodworking and building with timbers bigger than 2x4s. And to trade, to sail those ships and so forth, you've got to have people that understand the mechanics of sailing and navigating. And so you've got to have people with more skills, in a sense, different skill set than Solomon's people have. So he hires the men that he needs. You get down here to chapter 5 and verse 13. Solomon drafted forced labor out of all Israel, 30,000 men. But then look at verse 15. Solomon had 70,000 burden bearers and 80,000 stone cutters in the hill country, besides 3,300 chief officers over all the work. And at the king's command, they quarried out great costly stones to lay the foundation with dressed stones. And Solomon's builders and Hiram's builders and the men of Gibeah did the cutting and prepared the timber and the stone to build the house. So with the guidance of Hiram's craftsmen, they're able to get this done. So in chapter 6 now, we come to the actual construction of the temple. 480 years after the people of Israel came out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, the 2nd month, he began to build the house of the Lord. 60 cubits long, 20 cubits wide, 30 cubits high. The building, the structure itself, 90 feet long, 30 feet wide, 45 feet tall. I think I reversed the height and the width a minute ago when talking about it. That's not even a good sized warehouse by modern standards. Now, I live in a pretty ordinary little 1,700 and something square foot house. My house is 60 feet long and about 32 feet wide. So the temple building itself that would house the holy place and the most holy, or the Holy of Holies, was actually just about a third bigger than the house I live in. Ordinary 3-bedroom, 2-bath house. It's going to be magnificent. 4.5 stories tall, basically, in modern height standards. So it's a tall building. It would have towered over practically everything else in Jerusalem at the time, except maybe the palace. But it's not this, let's put it this way, it's not the temple in Temple Square in Salt Lake City, the Mormon temple. It's not the Vatican in Rome that takes up acres of land. It wouldn't hold hundreds or thousands of people inside. And of course, people didn't get to go inside anyway. The priests did.
That's what I was going to ask. It was It wasn't even all the Levites, just the priests
Just
in
the priests.
rotation, right?
You're right.
Yeah.
Just the priests go inside to perform their priestly duties. So it's not a church building. It's not a gathering place. Now the grounds around it, the courtyard and so forth, the porch in front of it increases the length of it by about 15 feet. So you've got an entryway on the east side of it that's going to be about 15 feet deep by roughly 30 feet wide. Solomon's porch or portico, the entryway. The grounds around it are going to occupy maybe a couple of acres, a couple of 100 feet in every direction. But we're not talking about a huge, huge complex. Now, 1,000 years, 900 years down the road, when Herod comes on the picture, on the scene, and starts to rebuild and expand and enlarge, not Solomon's temple, but Zerubbabel's temple, the second temple, the post-exile temple. Remember, Solomon's temple, there is no remnant of Solomon's temple.
So Nehemiah, when he went to rebuild it, it wasn't Solomon's temple?
No, they had to start from scratch because the Babylonians demolished it right down to the ground. So what they built was a poor man's copy of Solomon's temple. You know, it didn't have the grandeur, it didn't have the same quality of materials, it didn't have the gold and the precious materials in it that Solomon's temple had. Solomon's temple was magnificent to look at, no doubt. But the Babylonians demolished it.
Didn't the older guys cry?
Oh, yeah.
The first
You're right. In the days that they laid the foundation of Zerubbabel's temple, of the second temple, the old men who could, as little children, could remember Solomon's temple, they wept because they could see this wasn't going to be anything like that. Well, Herod comes along 900 years from Solomon's time and starts to remodel and enlarge and beautify not Solomon's temple, but the second temple. And it really is going to be a huge, beautiful, amazing thing when he's done. And the irony of it is that at the time that Jesus is there, you know, challenging the scribes and the Pharisees, and they take him to task. Well, this building's been under construction for 46 years, and you tear it down and rebuild it in 3 days. And they didn't understand what he was talking about. Well, it wasn't finished even then. It was finished about 69 AD. About 69 AD, about 25 years after Jesus was crucified. And what happens late 69, early 70? Here come the Romans and bulldoze it down again. And the only thing left of that temple, which is not Solomon's temple, is what we typically call the Wailing Wall, or the Western Wall, which is underneath the Dome of the Rock, which is a Muslim mosque. Well, Solomon didn't have the necessary skilled labor to do all of this. So he had to import help from Hiram of Tyre. Now, as we go along in chapter 6, we have a description here, 480 years after Moses brings them out of captivity, 60 cubits long, 20 cubits wide, 30 cubits high. So it's 90 feet long, 30 feet wide, 45 feet tall. The vestibule in front was 20 cubits long, equal to the width of the house, 10 cubits deep, 15 feet deep. Made for the house windows with recessed frames or with beveled frames. That means the windows had slim openings in them. They were not windows that opened. They were windows for ventilation and for protection. They were not movable window frames. And the description, a structure against the walls of the house, running around the house, the nave, the inner sanctuary, side chambers all around. The lowest story was 5 cubits wide, The middle one, 6 cubits wide. The third one was 7 cubits wide, and so forth. So we've got all of the details here, the surrounding structure and all of this. And come down here to verse 7. When the house was built, it was with stone prepared at the quarry, so that neither hammer nor axe nor any tool of iron was heard in the house while it was being built. It's a prefab building. They cut all the wood in a wood yard somewhere off site. They quarried all the stone. They cut it and dressed it in the quarry before they ever brought it to Jerusalem. So that when they brought it to Jerusalem, basically what you have here is a giant 3D jigsaw puzzle. Put all the pieces in place. Everything's already pre-cut, pre-measured, pre-notched and tenoned and so forth. Just have to put it together so that it could be done quietly. Well, as we go along here, you find that in 2 Chronicles chapter 3, as we're looking at this, you look at chapter 6, he built the walls with cedar, with boards of cedar, from the floor of the house to the walls of the ceiling, covered them inside with wood, carved all the walls of the house round about with carved figures of cherubim and palm trees and open flowers within and without. Which this is an interesting point, because many among even some modern Orthodox Jews consider any kind of visual artistry to be just anathema, forbidden. There are even some among the ultra-Orthodox who would consider that acting as an occupation or even as a pastime is a violation of this not making any graven images, which, you know, you're not carving yourself, but that they would present this as you're representing yourself as something else. But here in the temple, you do have artwork of cherubim and flowers and so forth. Nothing that would resemble the imagery of the idolatry of that day, animals, bullocks and fish and so forth. But you do have this. And you come down here to verse 15 and verse 30 in chapter 6. You have the parallel in 2 Chronicles chapter 3. Made the floor of the house with boards of fir, and the floor of the house he overlaid with gold inside and out. Now, that's, if you've ever had to even just buy gold foil to imprint a name on a book, that's not cheap. And to do this, to overlay something with gold, is a massive undertaking, both in expense and in the actual process of it. Come down here to verse 31. At verse 23, in the inner sanctuary, he made 2 cherubim of olive wood, each 10 cubits high, 15 feet tall, which that's interesting from the standpoint of how do you know what a cherubim looks like? That's a variety of angel, apparently. And how do you know what that looks like? I mean, you can't exactly pull out a Polaroid and catch one just flitting by. So
But
there's
the mercy seat had 2 cherubim on it.
yeah.
Those instructions would have come from God.
Yes, the mercy seat had 2 cherubim facing each other on the top of it. So maybe you've got a model there that they could use. But as we go along down here, come down to verse 31, for the entrance to the inner sanctuary. Now this is going into the building. Doors of olive wood, the frame, the lintels, and the doorposts were a 5th part of the wall, and they're carved as well. As you go on, they're overlaid with gold. He spread the gold on the cherubim of palm trees. Verse 33, he made for the entering of the temple doorposts of olive wood. And this goes on, and you have enormous detail here, intricate detail. Solomon, at the same time, is building himself a house, building himself a palace. Now, you come down to the end of the chapter. In the 4th year, the foundation of the house was laid in the month of Ziv. So 4 years, the foundation is finished. The 11th year, in the month of Bull, which is the 8th month. So you go from the 4th year of Solomon's reign to the 11th year of Solomon's reign. It takes 7.5 years to build this building. You know that a huge part of that time was simply moving materials. How long does it take to move a big rock when you have to roll it on rollers and pull it with manpower? Y'all excuse me a minute, I'm getting a text from Sam, and yeah, but I'm not seeing him in the waiting room. He may have been there and I just didn't notice. Anyhow, so it takes 7.5 years to build this structure, all handmade, all built to be fitted piece by piece together, all built so that when all the pieces are in place, it's ready to use. At the same time, Solomon's building a palace. David had a palace, and no doubt Solomon probably built on that or incorporated some of that. But what Solomon is going to build is orders of magnitude more grandiose. So you pick up in chapter 7, he's building his own house, and that takes him nearly twice as long, 13 years. On the other hand, it's going to be a lot bigger. Well, you think about it. He's got to house not just himself and his immediate staff, and not just have some administrative facilities, a banquet hall and a meeting hall and so forth. Before long, he's going to have a passel of wives and a bunch of kids.
I was gonna say, he has to have, enough, has to have it big enough to house all those women and concubines.
He's going to have one serious dormitory, isn't he? So,
Not to mention all the hired hands and all those people.
will help if you go back,
Yeah,
like we were talking last week. What was one of his first orders of business when he became king? He picks out a prince from each tribe, basically, and says, okay, this month is your month to supply the needs of the king and the court, and this month is your month. And some of them couldn't have been too happy about that, because that's a huge financial burden. And it appears that he did not do that strictly by tribe, but more by administrative district. All these guys represented the 12 tribes, but he seems to have divided the land up more or less to suit himself in that respect. Well, he built the house of the forest of Lebanon, 100 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, 30 cubits high. Well, it's the same height as the temple. No, it's the same height as the temple, but it's much bigger, much longer, much wider, built on 4 rows of cedar pillars with cedar beams on the pillars, covered with cedar above the chambers. And just, this is tremendous. As you keep going, He made the hall of pillars. Its length was 50 cubits, verse 6. And its width was 30 cubits. And there's a porch in front and a canopy in front of them. He made the hall of the throne, where he was to pronounce judgment, the hall of judgment, finished with cedar from the floor to the rafters. His own house, where he was to dwell in the other court, back of the hall, was of similar workmanship. And he made a house like this hall for Pharaoh's daughter. So he's just building, 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 building. Jerusalem is exploding under his reign. Now, in this, there would have been a lot of popularity because he's building a magnificent looking place, and there would be contracts to be let, and there'd be a lot of people making money out of the royal treasury. But also, there are a lot of people being put to work, not necessarily in the things they want to do, and not necessarily doing the things that they want to do. Come down to verse 9. All these were made of costly stones, cut according to measure, sawn with saws, back and front, even from the foundation to the coping, from the outside to the great court. So every part of it, basically, every part of Solomon's temple, Solomon's palace, it's custom made. I worked for a number of years for a custom home builder, and building custom homes is not like building tract houses or apartments. They want to, the people that build custom homes are going to go through and they're going to pick everything from the tile on the floor to the paint on the walls, to the cabinets on the walls, to the light fixtures and the doorknobs and the cabinet knobs and the hinges. And, every single detail, there's just a list longer than my leg of choices. And you can spend serious money in short order just by custom picking everything. In Fayetteville, where I live, there's a fairly new addition that has gone up in the last 5 years, not far from the church building. Hello, Brother Sam. And in that particular addition, the sign as you go in says houses starting in the 300s, $300,000. Well, starting in the 300s means they start at $399.99. But one of our young couples who got married about 3 years ago went over there one afternoon when the place first opened up just to investigate. And they quickly, they went through, oh, I like this house and I like this and I like that and I like this and I like that. When they got through just touring, they were looking at a $650,000 house. Custom everything. They didn't buy that, which that was to their credit. They had more sense than that. Go ahead, Mr. Brown.
Now, since the Israelites didn't have the technology, then who was the designer, the Tyre and Saddam that built Solomon's? Who had the technology to do the building, if you understand?
Well, Hiram of Tyre has the skilled craftsman,
right,
to carry out the design. Now, the design, you look at the measurements, and the design is clearly modeled on the proportions of the tabernacle. So you, in one sense, you've got a model of sorts just in the tabernacle. And remember, the tabernacle 400 years earlier was built out of the finest material that they could furnish, and it was done with inspired craftsmanship. So you've got a pattern that you can follow there. But in this, did Solomon draw the design? I don't know. Did Solomon go through and say, I want this and this and this and this and this? I don't know. But it clearly, in general, it's modeled on the tabernacle. It's bigger and taller and more grandiose, and certainly going to be a lot more magnificent, just because it's a building, not a giant tent. And so it's going to be hugely impressive, but some of the skills necessary to build it, to cut the stones, to cut the timbers and so forth, Solomon didn't have those skilled workmen at his disposal. He had to hire the help to get that done. Well, you come into chapter 7 in 1 Kings, and the parallel is over in 2 Chronicles chapter 3, less detail in 2 Chronicles. And what we have in chapter 7 is a description of the furnishings. And I find it interesting that basically, except for the Ark of the Covenant, the temple seems to get pretty much all new furniture, which sort of begs the question, what did they do with the furnishings from the tabernacle, the altar of incense and the lampstand and so forth? And my answer to that is, I don't know. But here we have new furnishings being built, 2 pillars being built, chapter 7, verses 15 through 22. And these are roughly 25 feet tall, pillars of brass, a line 12 cubits encompassed either of them. So that tells you how big around they were. They were huge. You have vessels for the temple and so forth. Back up in 1 Kings chapter 7 to verse 13. And at verse 13, King Solomon went and brought Hiram from Tyre. He was the son of a widow of the tribe of Naphtali, and his father was a man of Tyre, a worker in bronze. Now, this is evidently not the king, but a craftsman who shares the king's name. He's full of wisdom, understanding, skill for making any work in bronze, and he came to King Solomon and did all his work. So here's what he did. He built the 2 pillars, and one of them is named Yakin, and the other is named Boaz. Well, Yakin is not necessarily so familiar, but Boaz is a familiar name. Who's Boaz? Boaz, Ruth's husband. This is Solomon's great great grandfather. Yeah. So there's some interesting.
So what are you saying about Boaz? I'm not seeing that.
Down here in chapter 7 at verse 21, when they set up the pillars at the porch of the temple, and these are huge. They're going to be roughly yay big around. My wingspan is about 6.5 feet, so these are going to be probably 6-8 feet thick. And they named those pillars. They called one Yakin, and the other one they called Boaz. There at verse 22. And Yakin means he shall establish, clearly meaning God. And Boaz, the name of Solomon's ancestor, in him is strength. Well, now then we're going to create a brass altar and a brass sea, or the molten sea, as King James calls it. That is a great big basin, a big laver for washing the sacrifices. And you think about this, when we get to chapter 8, we're going to find a list of the sacrifices offered when this structure is dedicated. And so this basin for washing the sacrifices, it's not going to be something the size of this lectern. It's not going to be something the size of a dining table. It's got to be huge, because it's going to have to service sacrifice after sacrifice after sacrifice after sacrifice, and they're going to have a ready supply of fresh water for it because of the volume of sacrifices they offer. Now, if you have ever had occasion, and maybe you have, maybe you haven't, both of my grandfathers were farmers. And so between them and growing up in a small town and so forth, the butchering of animals is not a foreign thing to me. If you've ever had occasion to see an animal butchered, slaughtered, even if it's just a sheep or a lamb, that's a messy process. You've got the blood to deal with, and you've got the entrails and the innards and so forth, and it's got to be skinned and rinsed and washed. You don't do that with a squirt bottle. It takes buckets of water to do that. And then you expand that to an animal the size of an ox or a cow, we're talking a lot of work and a lot of water. So this is a big basin. Look at the dimension that's given here. 10 cubits from brim to brim down here in chapter 7, verse 23, 15 feet across. Well, 15 feet. If I step over here, I'm standing now, maybe you can see me on screen. I'm standing almost 15 feet from the computer, from the camera. That's a big basin. That would hold not hundreds, but potentially thousands of gallons, depending on how deep it is. It's 5 cubits deep. That's almost 8 feet deep. That's a lot of water. My oldest son-in-law's grandparents have a water tank that supplies their house. It's, I think, 8 feet across and 6 feet tall. And if memory serves me, it holds 3,000 gallons. Maybe it's 2,500. This would be about double that. Huge amount of water just to handle the sacrifices. You continue on down in verses 40 and down from verse 40 to 50, you've got the rest of the vessels of the temple. At verses 27 to 37, you have 10 bases and 10 lavers. Down here in verse 38, 10 basins for washing. This is not for the sacrifices now, but for the priests who are ministering there. And you come down to verse 36 in chapter 6. 1 Kings chapter 6, we'll back up for a minute. He built the inner court with 3 courses of cut stone and 1 course of cedar beams. But then you look at chapter 7 and pick up at verse 40. Hiram also made the pots and the shovels and the basins and finished all the work that he did for King Solomon on the house of the Lord. 2 pillars, 2 bowls of the capitals that were put on top of the pillars, 2 lattice works to cover, and so forth, and 400 pomegranates for the lattice work, 10 stands, 10 basins on the stands, the 1 sea or the big basin, and the 12 oxen underneath the sea. Now the pots, the shovels, the basins, all these vessels in the house of the Lord, this is verse 45, which Hiram made for King Solomon, were of burnished or polished bronze, polished brass. This was done to look magnificent. But then pick up at verse 48. Solomon made all the vessels. That's not Solomon himself, but had the vessels made. The vessels that were in the house of the Lord, the golden altar, the golden table for the bread of the presence, the lampstand of pure gold, the flowers, the cups, snuffers, basins, all these different little bits and pieces. All the work that Solomon did on the house of the Lord was finished. And Solomon brought in the things that David, his father, had dedicated, the silver, the gold, the vessels, and stored them in the treasuries of the house of the Lord. So you have a summary of all of this. 50 cups and snuffers and all these bits and pieces that go with serving in the temple. So that brings us down to chapter 8. And we'll take a rapid look, because we're going to get behind if we don't, at chapter 8 and the dedication of the temple, and then we'll take our break. So, chapter 8, the first 11 verses, we're going to remove the tabernacle and everything that's associated with it from Zion to the temple. Everything that's associated with the tabernacle, namely the Ark of the Covenant, primarily, but everything that's associated with it is going to be brought up to the temple. Solomon assembled the elders of Israel, all the heads of the tribes, leaders of the fathers' houses, and so forth, in Jerusalem to bring up the Ark of the Covenant out of the city of David, which is in Zion. All the men of Israel assembled, all the elders of Israel came, the priests picked up the ark, and they brought up the ark to the Lord, the ark of the Lord, the tent of meeting, all the holy vessels that were in the tent. The priests, the Levites brought them up. Solomon and all the congregation who had assembled before him were with him before the ark, sacrificing so many sheep and oxen that they could not be counted or numbered. Well, that's kind of a hyperbole, because we're fixing to see some extraordinary numbers of sacrifices a little bit later. But they bring the Ark of the Covenant to the place in the inner sanctuary, to the most holy place. So they bring it into the temple proper. The temple, if this marker works, the temple is a rectangle. It's 3 times as long as it is wide, and the front half of it is the holy place. So you've got 3 proportions of it. I don't know if you can see that on the screen or not, but the doorway would be here on the east side, facing the sunrise, so to speak. And all of the particulars, the furniture and so forth, would go out here, with the Ark of the Covenant here in the most holy place in the back corner. Now the back third, rather, not quarter. That third, that part, the most holy place, dimensionally is a cube. It's the same width and length and height inside. So it's a square, cube inside. And that's the thing that's in there, is the Ark of the Covenant. They bring all of this stuff in and begin to set it up. And notice as you come down here, verse 6, the priests brought the Ark of the Covenant to the place in the inner sanctuary underneath the wings of the cherubim. The cherubim spread out their wings over the place of the ark, so that the cherubim overshadowed the ark and its poles. And the poles were so long that the ends of the poles were seen from the holy place before the inner sanctuary, but they could not be seen from outside. And they are there to this day. There was nothing in the ark except the 2 tablets of stone that Moses put there at Horeb, where the Lord made a covenant with the people of Israel. And when the priests came out of the holy place, a cloud filled the house of the Lord, so that the priests could not stand to minister because of the cloud. So here we're beginning to put the temple into use. You pick up at verse 12, and now you have the beginning of Solomon's dedicatory address, dedication of the temple and the bestowing of God's promise. The ark is placed in its place. The poles that they used were so long that they stick out into they stick out here into the more common area, and that is according to the law, Exodus 25 and verse 15. And at this point, the tablets of stone are all that's in the ark. No pot of manna and Aaron's rod and so forth, apparently. Pick up at verse 12, and now Solomon begins to speak. The first thing he says is a speech praising God. Solomon sees the cloud and acknowledges that as God's acceptance of the temple, God accepting the temple and dwelling in it. If you flip back to Leviticus chapter 16, when the tabernacle was constructed, in Leviticus chapter 16, concerning the Day of Atonement, the Lord spoke to Moses after the death of the 2 sons of Aaron. And verse 2 said to Moses, "Tell Aaron your brother not to come at any time into the holy place inside the veil before the mercy seat that's on the ark, so that he may not die, for I will appear in the cloud over the mercy seat." Well, what do we see here? Now the cloud is over the mercy seat in the temple. So that's understood to be, okay, God is accepting the temple as the new site for meeting with him, basically. And verse 14, Solomon asked for God's blessings on the nation. The king turned around, blessed all the assembly of Israel while they stood. "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Israel, who with his hand has fulfilled what he promised with his mouth to David, my father." And he talks about all that God has done. Solomon is standing on a raised scaffolding, or he's on his knees actually on a raised scaffolding where he can be seen. He's holding up his hands, verse 54. And notice back here from verses 17 to 21, what Solomon says before he begins to pray is, this was my father's desire, my father's idea, and I have done everything according to the will of God. He talks about how that God had forbidden David to build the temple. Now he has fulfilled his promise. I have risen in the place of David, my father. I have built the house for the name of the Lord, and we've done everything that was required. Every I dotted, every T crossed. So at verse 22, he begins to pray. And the prayer goes down to the end of the chapter, basically, almost to the end of the chapter, to verse 53. And then the rest of it is his benediction for the people. But you look at the prayer, and several things ought to stand out. Number one, he emphasizes, we recognize no other God can keep promises like you can, verses 23 and 24. You look at 23 and 24, there is no God like you in heaven above or on earth beneath, keeping covenant, showing steadfast love to your servants who walk before you with all their hearts, who have kept with your servant David, my father, what you declared to him. You've kept your promise. No other God does this. Keeps a promise to a dead man. Going on, he asks, then now I'm asking you, keep your promises with me. We know that you're ever present, verse 33. Verse 33, when your people Israel are defeated before the enemy because they have sinned against you, if they turn again to you and acknowledge your name and pray and plead with you in this house, then hear in heaven and forgive and bring them back. So the appeal, continue to hear our prayers, judge righteously, accept our repentance when we do repent. When you send drought and we repent, please remove the drought, and so forth. Verse 36, hear in heaven and forgive the sin. It's interesting, Solomon 3 times here talks about his people falling into sin and needing to be forgiven. There is a huge irony in this, because who's going to wind up leading them in sin, in a sense, later in his reign? Solomon is he's going to go from the head of the parade praising God to the head of the parade needing to be forgiven. And you might be forgiven if you almost wonder if he's not foreseeing just how messed up he's going to be. But he continues in this vein. If there's famine in the land, when we acknowledge it and repent, forgive us. Come down here to verses 40 and 41, or 41 and 42, and there's an interesting statement here. When a foreigner who's not of your people comes from a far country, when he comes and prays toward this house, verse 42, hear in heaven, hear from your dwelling place, and do according to all for which the foreigner calls to you, in order that all peoples of the earth may know your name and fear you, as do your people Israel. So it's interesting, here's Solomon expressing in this dedication prayer something that the scribes and the Pharisees of Jesus' day would have been spitting on the ground to express, and that is that foreigners, non-Hebrews, could be acceptable to God. You get down to Jesus' day, and the conventional wisdom among the Jews is us and only us and nobody else, and God just doesn't even care about all y'all out here. But that's not Solomon's prayer here. And of course, they would not have rejected Solomon. Come on down to verse 44, a request for them to be accepted if they go into captivity. If your people go out to battle by whatever way you send them, and they pray so that you have chosen that house that I built in your name, then hear and maintain their cause. If they sin against you, verse 46, for there's no one who does not sin, and you're angry with them and give them to an enemy so that they're carried away captive to the land of the enemy, far off or near. Yet if they turn in their heart to the land to which they've been carried, and repent and plead with you, if they repent with all their mind and all their heart, then hear and restore them. Because verses 51, 52, 53, why would Solomon ask all of this? Your people are your heritage. You brought them out of Egypt from the midst of the iron furnace. Let your eyes be open to the plea of your servant and to the plea of your people, giving ear to them whenever they call to you. You separated them from among all the peoples of the earth. You chose them. Now you pick up at verse 54. Solomon finishes his prayer, and now he's going to give a benediction, a blessing for the whole congregation. And in this blessing, one of the things he emphasizes at verse 56, not one word of all of God's good promises that he promised through Moses has failed. Look at verse 56 in chapter 8. You get down here, blessed be the Lord who has given rest to his people according to all that he has promised. Not one word has failed of all his good promise, which he spoke by Moses, his servant. Well, what does that say for us today? That says that our friends that believe that Jesus still has to come and reign on an earthly throne because God never gave Israel all the territory he promised, they're wrong. Because Solomon says every promise God made to Moses, that would include the boundaries of the territory, which is where the millennialist folks want to camp and say, well, they didn't get this little sliver over here and they didn't get this little piece over here, and the boundaries don't match up and all of this. Solomon says God fulfilled his promise completely in every detail. So this idea that national Israel are still God's exclusive chosen people because the promise hasn't been completely fulfilled, John Hagee and his ilk, they have to argue with Solomon. They have to argue with Joshua. Solomon and Joshua say that God kept his promises. Now, if you flip over to 2 Chronicles chapter 7 for just a minute, in the first 3 verses, as we're leading up to all of this, as soon as Solomon finished his prayer, fire came down from heaven and consumed the burnt offering and the sacrifices, and the glory of the Lord filled the temple. And the priest could not enter the house of the Lord because of the glory of the Lord that filled the Lord's house. When all the people of Israel saw the fire come down and the glory of the Lord on the temple, they bowed down with their faces to the ground on the pavement and worshiped and gave thanks to the Lord, saying, for he is good, his steadfast love endures forever. So come back over here to chapter 8, look at verse 63. 63, 64, 22,000 oxen, 22,000 cattle, 120,000 sheep. Now, what that tells us is the whole nation is involved, not just Solomon, not just the heads of the tribes, but the whole nation is involved. And you can just imagine this takes place over days and days. It's not a do it in the morning and we're done in the afternoon kind of thing. The celebration is over on the 8th day, the next day after the second 7-day feast. That's 2 Chronicles chapter 7, verses 4 through 10. So it takes days to get all of this done. This is an ongoing celebration that takes over a week to accomplish. And you can just imagine the I hesitate to say pandemonium because that's not really the right idea, but you can just imagine the uproar that goes with this going on. Can you imagine the people being so excited about this? Can you imagine how many people must have been present, coming and going, and what crowds there must have been, and what it was like to have been there? And all of this in fulfillment of the promise God made to David years before. It's 10 till 8. Let's take our break. I've kept you a little bit long, so we'll come back and reconvene at 5 past. I wish I could figure out how to turn that off.
What, the recording in progress?
Yes, that it didn't used to do that. This latest update put that voice on there, and there doesn't seem to be any way to turn it off. Okay, so we got the temple built and dedicated. You come into 1 Kings chapter 9, and now, as soon as Solomon finished building the temple, what happens? The Lord appears. And this is the second time that the Lord appears to Solomon. It's interesting. We talked about last time. First, he appears to offer him blessings. Second time, he appears to give him what amounts to a warning. And the third time, it's not going to be good for Solomon. But at this,
I knew he was gonna do this. He knew he was gonna.
well, yeah, God. Yeah, I don't want to say that all of this is programmed, because it's not. But God is the one who knows the end from the beginning. So he knows all the possible outcomes, and knows the choices, good, bad, and indifferent, that we're going to make. So, second appearance, and this is God's answer to Solomon's prayer. You pick up here at verse 4, and it's personal. As for you, now he says, I've heard your prayer and the plea that you've put. And if you go back and you look at chapter 8, at Solomon's prayer, where's the focus of the prayer of dedication? The people, that's right, the nation, the whole of us, all of us. And God says here in chapter 9, I heard your prayer, I heard your plea, I've consecrated the house. I'm good with all that. But now he picks up at verse 4, and he doesn't exactly take Solomon to task. But if you think about it, what he's doing is saying, all right, Solomon, you prayed a good prayer. Now you need to make this personal, not just for the nation. This needs to be you personally. As for you, if you will walk before me like David your father walked, then I'll establish your throne. But if you turn aside, you or your children, and do not keep my commandments and serve other gods, here's what's going to happen. Look at verse 7. I will cut off Israel. In other words, the consequences are going to be much bigger than just you. There's a principle to think about here. The sinner, from Cain forward, basically, the sinner has always complained, you ought to leave me alone. My sin, I'm not hurting anybody but myself. That's a lie from start to finish. Because the consequences of sin always extend farther than just the sinner. And God is emphasizing that concept to Solomon right here. Solomon, if you do good, I'll bless you and bless your descendants. Solomon, if you mess up, or your descendants mess up, I'm not just going to take it out on you personally. I'm going to take it out on the nation. And we would look at that and argue, well, but Lord, you know, it's not their fault. And on a personal level, that's right. But who is the king? You're right. He's the guy that they came and asked for. And he is supposed to be the embodiment of the nation. He represents the whole nation. So, you know, Mr. King, you mess up, everybody is going to pay for your messing up. Now, God accepts the temple. If you do good, that's great. If you do evil, I'm going to get you. And look at verses 8 and 9. Why would this be the case? Well, at verses 8 and 9, you pick up at the end of verse 7, Israel would become a proverb and a byword among all peoples. Well, what's going to happen about 350 years down the road? 400 years down the road? Babylonian captivity, they're going to be a proverb and a byword among all the people because of their conquest and their sin. And this house, the temple, will become a heap of ruins. Everyone passing by it will be astonished and hiss or whistle, wow. And they will say, why has the Lord done thus to this land and this house? And they will say, because they abandoned the Lord their God, who brought their fathers out of the land of Egypt, and laid hold on other gods and worshiped them and served them. Therefore, the Lord has brought all this disaster on them. So here's what's going to happen. If you misbehave, you will have forgotten the Lord. Pick up at verse 10. And the rest of the chapter is the record of other things that Solomon accomplishes in the course of his reign. At the end of 20 years, Solomon had built the temple. He's now finished his palace, and he embarks on building up the kingdom. Look at what's going on here. He built the two houses, the house of the Lord and the king's house. Hiram, king of Tyre, supplied Solomon with cedar and cypress and gold as much as he desired, and Solomon gave him 20 cities in the land of Galilee. And Hiram felt like he'd been shortchanged. He was not pleased. And so you find that basically he gives them back.
I never understood why why he didn't like it.
Well,
I never understood why he was satisfied with what Solomon did.
notice what it's called. What kind of cities are these that you have given me, my brother? Verse 13. So they are called the land of Kabul. And this is not Kabul, Afghanistan. It's just a similarity of names, a homonym. They're called the land of Kabul to this day. Hiram sent to the king 120 talents of gold. He returns them because that word Kabul means useless, worthless. We don't know what the cities were.
The cities were worthless. But
Hiram's perspective is, what you've given me in payment isn't worth what I gave you. You've shortchanged me. This is of no use to me. And if you think about it, in the land of Galilee, the region of Galilee, what's in the area of Galilee? Well, you've got the Sea of Galilee, which, it's fine if you're a fisherman, but it's a big landlocked lake. The Sea of Galilee is about 13 miles long from north to south. It's about 8 miles wide at its widest point. It is deep, but it's at the Jordan River flows into it and flows out of it. It's at the joining of two separate mountain ranges. It's famous for violent storms. And the land around it really is nothing special. And Hiram is the king of Tyre. Now, Tyre, over on the Mediterranean coast, Tyre is the base of fishing fleets. Tyre is a major trading port. Tyre, Hiram is going to, in partnership with Solomon, they've got a navy and they've got a merchant fleet that goes all over the known world. Tyre is the shipping point for the cedars of Lebanon, for timber and for cut stone and things. And what Solomon gives him are cities in an area that, for everything that is profitable to Hiram, these cities are useless to him. There's nothing, there are no mines there. There are no big trees that could be harvested for timber. You might get a stone quarry out of the deal, but stone is only as valuable as how far you have to transport it. You could fish on the Sea of Galilee, but you can't transport the fish anywhere more than a day's journey away, and it's more than a day's journey over to the coast because they don't have refrigeration. So from Hiram's perspective, the territory that Solomon gives him, it's a nice gesture, but it's useless for all practical purposes. It doesn't add anything in terms of value to Hiram's kingdom. And so his response, this is not really any great benefit to me. So that may be the point where their relationship begins to deteriorate. Now, remember, in Saul, we see a man who starts out not necessarily close to God, but respectful of God and very humble. And Saul's head just inflates like a balloon, and his ego turns him away from God. With David, we see a man whose relationship with God, in one sense, is up and down and up and down and up and down and up and down, because David is a man who is very focused on God most of the time. But he does have his moments where he's not. Bathsheba, for example. He can get really far away from God in his behavior at times, but he always comes back. Solomon has that good example of faithfulness and repentance in his father, but where does Solomon come along in David's life? Yeah, Solomon comes along when David is in his 40s or maybe 50-ish. So Solomon has the example of David's faithfulness, David already reaping the consequences of some of his earlier mistakes and sins and so forth, and poor judgment, Absalom and Amnon and so forth. Solomon comes along as David has learned some hard lessons, but Solomon is young. And so even with good guidance, now at 40 years of age, roughly, 45, just between 40 and 50, let's say, now Solomon is at the height of his powers, the height of his wealth and influence and so forth. And he's beginning to focus more and more and more on himself, and less and less and less on God. So, at verse 15 in chapter 9, this is the account of the forced labor that Solomon drafted to build the house of the Lord, and his own house, and the Millo, and the wall of Jerusalem, and Hazor, and Megiddo, and Gezer. Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, had gone up and captured Gezer and burned it with fire. Now, remember, where did Solomon get Gezer? That was the city that Pharaoh had given as a dowry with his daughter when Solomon married her. But somewhere in there, there's been a falling out. And Pharaoh has burned it. So now he goes and rebuilds it. And Lower Beth Horon and Baalath and Tamar, and all of these places, the cities for his chariots, the cities for his horsemen. Notice what it says down here at verse 29. Whatever Solomon desired to build in Jerusalem, in Lebanon, in all the land of his dominion, whatever he wanted, he built. You think about having that kind of power, that kind of ability. I have 3 children, and my children are all grown. My daughters are married. My son is living on his own and responsible for himself. I don't have to feed anybody right now except me and my wife. There was a time when we would sit down and take stock of whether or not we could afford to take the kids to McDonald's, or we're going to have sandwiches for supper at home. And it was a treat to get to go to McDonald's. If I never set foot in another McDonald's again, it'll be too soon. But I'm past that point now where I have to check the bank balance before I decide if I can afford to eat out for lunch. I know that there's enough there that I can afford to go to Chick-fil-A for lunch and not worry about that I'm going to bounce a check or something. I don't have to feed 3 hungry kids anymore. Now I have to feed a horde of grandchildren, but only when they come to visit. Solomon, at this point in his life, has the wherewithal in material terms to do anything he wants. He can build any city he wants, any building he wants. He can fortify a city. He can station troops over here. He can move his stables over there. He can make an alliance with this king and marry her daughter. And he's got the oomph and the influence. He doesn't have to think about it and figure out how to do it. He just says it. I think I'll do this. When we're young and foolish, that sounds wonderful to us, doesn't it? When you have to count your pocket change the night before payday to see if you've got enough to buy a loaf of bread and a jug of milk so you can have breakfast the next morning, you think about, boy, it would be great if I didn't have to worry about that. But what happens when you don't have to worry about that? You start to trust in yourself, in your own ability. And that's what we see happening to Solomon here. Solomon drafts his own people. He impresses the Hivites and the Perizzites and all these other ites into slavery and puts his own people over them. But notice, come down here to chapter 9 and verse 34. You got 550 officers over charge of the people that are working and so forth. 1 Kings chapter 9, verse 24, not 34. The numbers in my Bible are very small. 24. Pharaoh's daughter went up from the city of David to her own house. Solomon built her. Then he built the Millo. 3 times a year, Solomon used to offer up burnt offerings and peace offerings on the altar that he built to the Lord, making offerings with it before the house of the Lord. So he finished the house. He built a fleet of ships at Ezion Geber, which is near Eloth, on the shore of the Red Sea in the land of Edom. So this is off to the south. So he's got Hiram, the king of Tyre, over here, and he's got ships down here as well. Hiram sent with the fleet his servants, seamen who were familiar with the sea, together with the servants of Solomon. They went to Ophir and brought from there gold, 420 talents, brought it to King Solomon. Well, he's hit that point in life where he can do anything he wants to do. And he begins to do anything he wants to do. So he's powerful, he's profitable. And now the Queen of Sheba in chapter 10 appears. So the parallel is 2 Chronicles chapter 9. Sheba is the country of the Sabaeans. This is an Arabian queen. It's off to the south and east of Israel. The capital city is Saba. Historically, her name is Balkis. And interestingly, she's mentioned in the Quran in Surah 27. So she comes to him, brings all kinds of pack animals and wealth and spices and so forth, which was typical of the way they traveled. The Sabaeans in this period were noted for their wealth in precious stones, and their wealth came from trade. They were traders primarily. So she comes to him with hard questions, riddles. What do you do about this? How would you handle that? Here's a scenario. What would be the solution? And verse 3 says that Solomon answered every question. Now remember, what had God done? God had endowed him with wisdom, with insight, with understanding. And so royalty judges royalty. The queen judges the king. Queen of the Sabaeans, the Queen of Sheba. She saw the wisdom, the palace, food of his table, and all of his officials, and the bearing of all of his servants, and it took her breath away. She was blown away. Now, why did she come in the first place? Well, she'd heard about him, yeah. She had questions, but did she come simply seeking answers? Probably. Well, she's heard about him. She's curious, plainly. She may not have believed everything that she'd heard about him. Later on, she's going to say, here's the sum of it. The half has not been told. But given her background and her people, she's probably come seeking economic opportunity as well. Solomon is arguably maybe the only trillionaire in history by the time everything is said and done. He's making a fortune trading in concert with Hiram and his fleets. It would be very reasonable, given her background, she wants in on the action. So that may be the ulterior motive to bring her to him. And she judges him, verses 6 and 7, twice as good as anything that she's heard. The half has not been told. Your orders of magnitude better than everything I heard. And she was blown away by everything she saw. Look at verses 8 and 9, though. In verses 8 and 9, happy are your men, happy are your servants who continually stand before you to hear your wisdom. Now, the servants there, we're not talking about the butler and the guy that scrubs the floor. We're talking about the ministers of state, the counselors and so forth. The men that normal kings would turn to for advice. She says they're blessed because they get to hear your wisdom. instead of you turning to them for wisdom, they get to listen to you. You're wiser than all of them. That's the gist of what she's saying here. And in verse 9, blessed be the Lord your God, who has delighted in you and set you on the throne of Israel. So she acknowledges the God of Israel as a great God. That doesn't mean that she becomes a worshiper of him. She may well have been a pagan or a polytheist. She might have been very willing to worship him along with her gods or what have you. But she acknowledges you couldn't have done this on your own. You must serve a tremendous God. And in verse 10, the gifts that she gives basically match her words, match her appraisal of Solomon. 120 talents of gold, a very great quantity of spices, precious stones. Never again came such an abundance of spices as those that the Queen of Sheba gave to Solomon. So she set the bar for precious things that were given to him. And in return, verse 13, he also pours out great gifts on her as well. Now, if you've watched the Cecil B. DeMille back in the 50s, I forget if I think it wasn't Charlton Heston that played Solomon. It was Yul Brynner, I think, that played Solomon in the movies. If you've watched that, DeMille posits this relationship between Solomon and the Queen of Sheba and all of this stuff, and the Rastafarian cult tries to place her in Ethiopia and make her the queen of ancient Ethiopia, and that there's a descendant of Solomon on the throne in Ethiopia. And Haile Selassie, who ruled Ethiopia in the early part of the 20th century, tried to assert the claim that he was the descendant of the Queen of Sheba and King Solomon and so forth. It makes good storytelling in the movies. There is nothing in the Bible to support that.
I've always heard that. They have
Yeah.
kids and all of
Yeah.
that.
Given his proclivities, it's not beyond the range of possibilities, but there's nothing in the Bible to support that. So Solomon pours out great gifts on her as well at verse 13, and off she goes back to her own land with her servants ultimately. And whether she has a trade agreement with him, I don't know. The rest of this, down through the end of the chapter, is a record of Solomon's wealth, just the splendor of his kingdom. And you find the parallel in 2 Chronicles chapter 9 in verses 13 through 27. So let me catch up in my text here. You have mentioned in 16 and 17 the shields. The weight of gold in verse 14, 666 talents of gold, besides what comes from explorers and the merchant business and so forth. Solomon made 200 large shields of beaten gold, 600 shekels of gold in each one, and 300 shields of beaten gold. So you've got two sizes of shields. The bucklers, as they're called in the King James, these are great big for the protection of the whole body. This would be a tall, hide behind it kind of shield. And then the regular would be a smaller, what the Scottish call a targe, that would be, like a Roman shield that you could protect your face and your upper body with. These are decorative. They're intended for the beautification of the house. He put them in the house of the forest of Lebanon, builds an ivory throne and overlays it with gold. Verses 21, 22, 23. What you see here is just the excess. All of King Solomon's drinking vessels were of gold. All of the vessels of the house of the forest of Lebanon were of pure gold. No silver. Silver was not considered anything in the days of Solomon. Just nothing special. And just the whole point is to emphasize the excess that comes in at this point. More gold than any other nation, verse 23. Solomon excelled all the kings of the earth in riches and in wisdom. Gold so plentiful that silver is useless. And then you look down here, he's got unusual livestock, apes and peacocks and things. A huge cavalry. Remember what Solomon said? Chariots and horsemen and so forth. Well, Solomon builds a huge cavalry spread out all over the kingdom. You find that referred to back in 2 Chronicles chapter 1, 14 through 17. 1,400 chariots, 4,000 horsemen, 4,000 horses, 12,000 horsemen. Just what does he need with all that? He rules that part of the world, basically. It's for show. Now, he does have his scrapes. He does have his battles with neighboring peoples as well. But the whole point here is to emphasize this is just wealth beyond reason. Solomon's claim to fame in history, from a biblical point of view, we zero in on his wisdom. But his life almost gives the lie to that, because where did he put most of his energy? Power, wealth, building, influence, women, yeah, wine, women, and song. You look at the end of the chapter. Here's the trade that Solomon conducted. Solomon's import of horses was from Egypt and Kuwait. The king's traders received them from Kuwait at a price. A chariot could be imported from Egypt for 600 shekels of silver, a horse for 150. And through the king's traders, they were exported to all the kings of the Hittites and the kings of Syria. So Solomon basically turns Israel into a crossroads, a merchant crossroads. And he takes a percentage off of everything that goes through. So, you know, as a businessman, Solomon is sharp. As a spiritual man, Solomon's not so bright, because with all that he's got going for him, what does he wind up doing? He winds up forgetting God. And chapter 11 tells us about that. Solomon loved many foreign women. Here's the beginning of the end. Solomon begins to turn away from God. And when he turns away, he starts to decline. Now, God's design for marriage, going back to the Garden of Eden. The Pharisees and the scribes came to Jesus in Matthew chapter 9, and they asked, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any cause? And what did Jesus do? The question was meant to test Jesus, but you have two different sects in the Jews, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and their perspective on the subject is different. Some say a man can divorce it. They didn't any of them agree a woman could divorce her husband, but a man can divorce his wife if he finds some unseemly thing in her. And you got one group that says that means she's fooling around on him. You got another group that says, no, she gets old and fat and wrinkled and ugly, kick her out and get you a new one. So you basically, you've got the liberals and the conservatives. That was bad enough. But what does Jesus do when he's confronted with that question? He sends them back to the scriptures. Have you not read? And he quotes Genesis 2:24. Therefore shall a man leave his father and his mother, cleave unto his wife, singular, and they two, husband and wife, shall be one flesh. Well, then why did Moses command us to divorce? and he again corrects their understanding. Moses didn't command anything. He allowed, because of your hard hearts. In other words, because you were already abusing the women in your lives, your ancestors were, Moses allowed what basically protected them. Deuteronomy 24, the law concerning divorce, which was what these guys were arguing about in the first place. What do we teach our children about marriage? What is God's basic design for marriage? One man married to one woman for life. That's the ideal. That's God's design. Now, people die. Sometimes people are unfaithful. Divorce may happen. And in some circumstances, there may be a remarriage. You know, the widow may choose to marry again, or the widower may marry somebody else. Abraham, love of his life, Sarah. Sarah dies. What does Abraham do? He marries a woman young enough to give him a whole house full of sons. Yeah, Keturah. So those things happen, but the norm, the ideal, go back to Genesis 2. One man married to one woman. Polygamy, one man with a bunch of women, that was never part of God's design. Now, God has sometimes tolerated things that he didn't approve of. He has endured things that he did not approve of. The fact that God endures something, that God does not immediately just smack somebody down for something, doesn't mean that he approves of what they're doing. Well, what takes place here? Solomon loved many foreign women, along with the daughter of Pharaoh, Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Sidonian, Hittite women from the nations concerning which the Lord said, don't marry these people. Solomon, in essence, what the inspired writer here tells us, and the Jewish tradition, by the way, the Talmudic tradition says that Jeremiah was probably the inspired writer of 1st and 2nd Kings, and then Ezra for the Chronicles. What the inspired writer is telling us is that at this point, Solomon basically in his actions is saying, I'm wiser than God. I'm smarter than God. I know better than God. I can do this and it won't affect me. What was the reason God said, don't let your sons marry their daughters, don't give your daughters to their sons? Exactly. They will sucker you into idolatry. What happened to Solomon? Right into idolatry. Just exactly what Moses and Joshua and Samuel had foretold. Don't marry these people because of the idolatrous influence. Solomon just plowed right into it. Solomon clung to these in love. He had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines, and his wives turned away his heart. Now, did Solomon have a different companion every night of the year for coming on to 3 years running? Maybe. I guess he had a Rolodex so he could remember who he was talking to. What's your name, honey? In reality, a lot of these relationships were probably primarily political and commercial. Okay, I'll take your daughter as a condition of our trade agreement, that sort of thing. And certainly he had plenty of trade with Egypt, and he was married to Pharaoh's daughter. He's Pharaoh's son-in-law. So there's more to that. These are not love matches, at least in most cases. They may in some cases be lust matches, which is certainly the concubines probably fall into that category. But the net result, regardless of what his intention was, they turned his heart away. They distracted him. Solomon, look at verse 5. Solomon went after Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites, and did evil in the sight of the Lord. Did not wholly follow the Lord like his father David. Built a high place for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, and for Molech, the abomination of the Ammonites. These are the religions that practice child sacrifice. And note it, but go on. Look at verse 8. So he did for all his foreign wives. Now it says in verse 5, he went after them. And that's a figure of speech. He actually worshiped them. Yeah, he participated in idolatry. He engaged in it himself. He didn't just allow them, he participated with them. Yeah. And he's old at this point. It's 50 plus at this point, old age, which, for some of us, that doesn't seem like that old, but for this man, that's he's running out of sand at a rapid rate. His acceptance of his wives pleading for these things, the very fact that he allowed it, even before he got around to participating in it himself, is counted as idolatry. Building these places of worship, allowing them to have the funds to have them built, that's counted as idolatry as well. To not condemn these things is to approve of them. Take your Bible, flip over to James chapter 1 for just a minute, over in the New Testament.
Like an old Jezebel. You ever heard that?
Oh yeah. Look at James chapter 1 and notice verses 14, 15. James chapter 1. Now we read in verse 13, let no one say when he is tempted, I am tempted by God, or God is doing this to me, because God cannot be tempted and God does not himself tempt anyone. But now look at verses 14 and 15. Each man is tempted, each person is tempted when he is drawn away, lured away by his own lust and seduced or enticed. And lust, when it conceives, produces sin. And sin, when it grows up, produces death. Solomon didn't condemn. He didn't object. He didn't resist. Well, that amounts to approval. He allowed it, and that was his downfall. Now, these wives, go back up here to verse 3. He had 700 wives, and they're described as princesses. These are wives who were elevated to first-class status in his palace. They're not necessarily princesses by birth, but they're elevated in Israel to that status. And then on top of that, you got this whole group over here, just playthings. That tells us where his heart is not. His heart is not with God. And so you get down to one of the saddest statements in the scripture here at chapter 11 and verse 9. The Lord was angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice and commanded him concerning this thing. So in other words, God warned him about this very thing. And that's what he went and did. He did not keep what the Lord commanded. Therefore, the Lord said to Solomon, since this has been your practice, you've not kept my covenant, my statutes that I've commanded you, I will surely tear the kingdom from you and give it to your servant. Yet for the sake of David, your father, I'll not do it in your days, but I will tear it out of the hand of your son. However, I will not tear away all the kingdom, but I will give one tribe to your son for the sake of David, my servant, and for the sake of Jerusalem that I have chosen. So
Now, when he was saying, when the Lord went to him, was he sending a prophet, or was it,
Well,
it was a prophet that was telling Solomon what thus says the Lord?
whether this is done by prophet or by personal speech, God appears to Solomon 3 times. This may be the 3rd time, but what we have here is an inspired record of God's judgment, whether spoken in so many words or not. So Solomon had not kept the commandment that God explicitly laid down. Don't do this. Solomon prays at the dedication of the temple about the nation and so forth. And God says, that's fine, that's well and good. Now you personally, individually pay attention. Don't do this. That's what Solomon does. And so God says, all right, you did not keep my commandments. You did not keep my commandment. So I've rejected you. I'm going to take the kingdom away from you, except for one tribe. And notice, number one, I'm going to give the majority of the kingdom to your servant, not your son. Well, that's Jeroboam. Jeroboam was Solomon's servant before he was Rehoboam's rival. But number two, he says, I'll leave one tribe for your son, but not for your sake, but because of the promise I made to your father David, and for the sake of the city that I have chosen. In other words, the only reason Judah gets to continue doesn't have anything to do with you. It's not your legacy. It's your father's. And at this point, Solomon starts to have trouble. Adversaries, enemies. The Lord raised up an adversary, Hadad the Edomite, of the royal house of Edom. When David was in Edom and Joab was the commander of the army, he struck down every male in Edom. But now things are turning around. Another generation, Edom is building back. And it's interesting, the Edomites are the descendants of Esau. They're blood kin, they're cousins to the Israelites. And their relationship, now, Jacob and Esau managed to bury the hatchet between them. They got along fine. But their kids, never. David conquered them. Solomon kept them under his thumb up to this point. Their history is going to be one of bitter hatred from both directions, all through history. What happens? The Edomites rebel, and they cause problems for Solomon. And then throughout the period of the kings, it's back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. We get down to the days of Zedekiah, and then Gedaliah the governor, and the conquest of Jerusalem and Judah by the Babylonians. And what are the Edomites doing? They're playing catch and release to the Babylonians. All the Jews that are trying to run away and get away, the Edomites are out there catching them and turning them in for a bounty, basically. God declares judgment through Obadiah against the Edomites. The whole little book of Obadiah is about judgment on the Edomites because they're all about money and profit and nothing about God. And of all people, they should be without excuse because they're Esau's children. But even so, they're not, God does not wipe them out. Because just keep going after the captivity. What happens to the Edomites? From 536, when Judah comes back from captivity, through the 400s down into the 300s when they're having to deal with Alexander the Great and the Greeks. The Edomites they're over here in Mount Seir, Petra, that city carved in stone in the Indiana Jones movie. That's a real place, and that's Petra, and that was part of Edom's territory. At the time that the Maccabees in the 2nd century BC throw off Greek control and domination and have a period of about 40 years of Jewish independence, what do they do with that time? They use that time to conquer their neighbors as best they can. And that includes the Edomites, who are now at that point beginning to be known not as Edom, but by a Greco-Roman name, Idumea. And the Edomites, the Idumeans, are forcibly converted at the point of the sword in the 2nd and 1st centuries BC. And the father of the man who would become Herod the Great is an Edomite prince. And Herod manages to marry a Jewish princess. And even though his family have become Jews because they were converted at sword point, with Roman backing, he becomes the king of the Jews and comes to be known as Herod the Great. So their destinies are intermingled all the way down to the time of Jesus. So we come back here. God raises up adversary after adversary. You got the Edomites, and then down here at what is this, verse 23, Rezon, the son of Eliada, the king of Zobah, and then Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, an Ephraimite. Now here's a fellow Hebrew down here at verse 26, a servant of Solomon. His mother's name was Zeruiah. She was a widow. He lifted up his hand against the king. He'd been a servant. Now notice, look down here at verses 26 and 27. Here's the reason why he lifted up his hand against the king. Solomon built the Millo and closed up the breach of the city of David, his father. The man Jeroboam was very able. When Solomon saw that the young man was industrious, he gave him charge over all the forced labor of the house of Joseph. At that time, when Jeremiah went out of Jerusalem, the prophet Ahijah the Shilonite found him on the road. Now here's where Ahijah prophesies that God is going to raise you up as the king of the torn away tribes. Tears the garment in pieces. Take 10 pieces. I'm about to tear the kingdom from the hand of Solomon and give you 10 tribes. He shall have 1 tribe for the sake of my servant David and the sake of Jerusalem. And notice what he says later on. I will give you, I will take the kingdom out of his son's hand and give it to you, 10 tribes. Now there are 12 tribes plus Levi. Levi scattered all over the countryside. What's that 12th tribe? Well, you've got Judah on the south that God is not going to take away. And you've got 10 tribes that it's Benjamin, which functionally Benjamin is just basically being absorbed into Judah. They're tiny anyway. But notice the promise, I will take you, verse 37, you shall reign over all that your soul desires, be king over Israel, if you will listen to all that I command you and walk in my ways and do what's right in my eyes, keep my statutes and my commandments like David my servant, I will be with you and build you a sure house as I built for David and give Israel to you. So God offers Jeroboam the same deal, basically, that he did to David and to Solomon. Now, Jeroboam comes down to us throughout the rest of biblical history as Jeroboam who taught Israel to sin. Jeroboam turns out to be more politician than godly man, and he establishes idolatry. Well, that's later on. But up to this point, Jeroboam had been a servant of Solomon. But now he's selected by God to be basically an opponent to Solomon. And then ultimately to Rehoboam, Solomon's son. you come to the end of Solomon's life, and we didn't actually get to the section in our syllabus that we're supposed to cover tonight, which was Rehoboam and Jeroboam. We'll get to that next week. We've just burned up our week's leeway in the schedule. That's all right. Look at the end of chapter 11. The rest of the acts of Solomon, all that he did, his wisdom, are they not written in the book of the acts of Solomon? And the time that Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over all Israel was 40 years. Solomon slept with his fathers, was buried in the city of David, his father. Rehoboam, his son, reigned in his stead, reigned in his place. 40 years for Saul, 40 years for David, 40 years for Solomon. And now the kingdom is going to divide because of Solomon's foolish heart. The division is directly traceable to Solomon. Be sure your sins will find you out. That's a good place to stop. Questions, comments, thoughts, observations before we dismiss.
So he did pretty much what his father David did, right? As far as falling away with ideology, with the different women.
The difference is that David never fell in idolatry. David was foolish where women were concerned. He had a house full of wives and it brought him heartache. David never fell into idolatry. Solomon went way beyond David in wives. Solomon went way beyond basically anybody in wives. And he let them lead him into idolatry. And that is directly responsible for the division of the nation.
I don't remember, I think it's in Deuteronomy, where God warns the Israelites that it is not because they are anything special
Yep.
that he's sending them in to conquer that land of Canaan, to punish the people of Canaan.
Yep.
Not because you're righteous.
It's not because you're good, it's because they're bad.
Exactly. But that
You're just,
as humans, we tend to take things personally.
yep.
If we're given something good, oh, it's because I deserve it. Like with Solomon, Jeroboam.
Yep.
Oh, I must be something special.
Yep.
And the 29th,
You have to wonder, how could Jeroboam hear this promise from a known man of God and just blow it off
yeah,
when everything God promised up to that point comes to pass, and he prospers and he does well until he turns away? He could have had everything handed to him on a plate, basically, and he turned away from it.
the only other thing I wanted to say was that with Solomon and with Jeroboam especially, and all kings, if they lead the nation astray, they are culpable.
That's right.
But we are individually culpable for ourselves.
Absolutely.
We blame our leaders for drawing us away.
Well, you think about what does Proverbs 14 and verse 34 tell us? Righteousness exalts a nation. That's the character of the nation. Sin is a reproach to any people. Well, what else do we find? That's the corporate character. But individually, the soul that sinneth, it shall die. The father shall not bear the iniquity of the son, neither shall the son bear the iniquity of the father. Ezekiel chapter 18, verses 4 and 20. The individual is responsible. The character of the nation is a reflection of the character of each individual.
Yes. Yep, absolutely.
Well, we'll talk about Rehoboam and Jeroboam next week. We'll get
Sir,
Thank
be
you,
safe.
folks. Have a great evening.
All right, Randy, so-
Brother Sam, glad you were able to get in, and I'll send you the
Good
link.
night.
Good night, everybody.
July.